Hello everybody and welcome back to the Jack Threlfall Show. This is episode 33, and for our interview segment this week we are joined by a very, very special guest, Jonathan Kennard. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you very much for having me.
So could you explain a little bit about what your role in motorsport is at the moment?
Right now, the main focus is Ignition GP, which is a demonstration series that I've started, demonstration for 90s Formula One cars. And I've started it with my business partner, Adam Thorby. And it started because we have a shared passion of 90s F1 cars. We both are of a similar age. We grew up watching it, the Senna, Mansell, Prost battles, and there didn't really seem to be much going on in that regard, and there's a big demand for it. So that's the main focus for me at the moment, and making sure it's a success, really.
So where did your journey with motorsport start then? If you could take us back, when did it first come to mind that being a racing driver was a passion of yours, and how did that whole journey start?
Probably because I was crap at doing anything else. It was a massive passion from very early on. I was watching one of the earliest Grand Prix I watched was 92 Monaco, and it really stuck in my mind. And for anyone that doesn't know, that was probably in my mind, one of the best battles of Formula One history with Senna and Mansell in the closing laps of the Grand Prix. And I remember watching it and thinking, and I must have been about 6 at the time, and I was thinking, this is just the best thing I've ever seen. How can I do that? I need to try and do that. So that's how it started. I started with karting, as most people do. I didn't do anywhere near as much karting as a lot of drivers. And that is a regret of mine. I would like to have done more. I think it would have certainly helped in the junior career that I had. But then, I went into a championship called KERS, which was the saloon car racing series for teenagers. And I started at 15, I think, in that. And then it just went from there. And then I went to Formula Palmer Audi, which was absolutely fantastic series in my book, because everyone was driving the same car for one team. Really well run, and really enjoyed it as well. I liked the cars. There wasn't a huge amount of grip, but a reasonable amount of power, and that's really what I enjoy driving. If you wanted to, you could drift them. They were a lot of fun. So we're now in 2003 and 4, and I won that in 2004.
Oh wow!
That nominated me for the Young Driver of the Year award, as one of the sort of top 6 young drivers in British motorsport, which was a real big thing for me at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you had, you had Susie Stoddart, who's now Susie Wolf. She was in there. We had Paul de Rister, Mike Conway. There were some really good drivers that were part of the shortlist with me. So that was quite an honour. And then after that, it was Formula 3 all the way for the next 3 years. I won some races in Formula 3, in British Formula 3, when it was arguably probably the strongest championship in the world for junior single-seaters. Things have changed a lot since then, unfortunately, but it really was the place to be in 2005, 6 and 7. And then in 2008, I got a chance to start testing for Williams.
Wow,
which
yeah.
was obviously a major thing for me. And that was an absolute pleasure, and I'll probably go into that a bit later on, I guess, but it was a really interesting time with the development of Formula One. A lot of technical regulation changes around that time, which I was testing. And then going into 2009, I didn't do much racing. And then 2010, I got a chance to do Le Mans.
Incredible, wow.
Time. And then after that, it was GT1 World Championship with Lamborghini. And then sort of since then, it's been more historic racing, which I absolutely adore. I think it's absolutely fantastic. If anyone's watched any racing of historic racing, Goodwood or Silverstone Classic or whatever, they probably agree with me. It's really good, close racing. And I guess that's what slightly led me towards starting Ignition. So I guess that's me in a nutshell.
Fantastic. No, it's a great intro. I'd love to just jump back on what it was like growing up inside that environment of junior motorsport, because, you know, with the popularity of modern Formula One, people look so early on into drivers' careers as who might be the next prospect, what could happen if you take a Formula Renault Euro Cup or those sort of things going on now, FIA Formula 3. Everyone's so excited to look at, well, how early can we get these guys started? And I think particularly with Verstappen, right? He jumped straight from a international Formula 3 to his Formula 1 seat. And it's talents like that that really draw the eye to the junior formula. But what was it like growing up inside a motorsport environment there? How did you kind of balance that competitiveness and how different it really was to how most people grow up, I guess?
I don't think the teachers at my school liked it that much, if I'm being honest, because there was, plenty of Thursday and Fridays that I should have been at school that I wasn't. Don't necessarily advise that. I mean, try and find a way to continue your studies if you're racing, if you want to start racing and still at school. But it was difficult to juggle it. But when you sort of know that it's all you ever want to do, you've got to focus on it. And suddenly if you haven't focused on it and if you don't want it enough, then it's no point in doing it, basically. And you find that out soon enough, because you get to, in my case, like British Formula 3, and you're suddenly racing against people that have gone on to be race winner or championship winners in Formula 1. You realise how brutal it is. And if you haven't thrown everything at it at that point, it's going to be a waste of time. It's going to be tough. And you've got to factor in the amount of budgets that you're throwing at it. So you've got to be giving it everything you've got at that point.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the biggest storylines in junior motorsport is that funding battle and how drivers can attract sponsorship and all that kind of the business element to it there. Would you say that one of the biggest kind of elements of success in those junior categories actually happens off track? And there's a lot of learning that has to be done early on to really succeed, not only on track, but managing the environment around the track, your relationships with sponsors, attracting new sponsors, that whole sort of thing. How did you learn about that firsthand in your time in junior racing?
It's difficult, and it's probably the part of being a racing driver I dislike the most, if I'm being completely honest. It's really difficult because you're new to motorsport at that stage. You're new to how to go and find sponsorship. You've had minimal training in that. In my case, I was trying to get some big budgets to do GP2 right at the time of the financial crash in 2008, which made it almost impossible. But in a normal world, it's still very difficult. And you just have to grow up very quickly and work out what these companies that you're talking to actually want, because when you're starting out, you think it's just a sticker on the car. I mean, actually, that's almost irrelevant to a lot of the companies you'll be talking to try and get sponsorship. It's more about how can they entertain their clients at the races, and how can you deliver on that professionally and do it properly. And that's an area of being a racing driver that you really have to crack. The second biggest, I think, is like I say, it's a people business, and you need contacts. If you're very new to motorsport, you probably won't have any, and it's really difficult. And one thing I'd say to any aspiring young driver is just go up and talk to people. They 9 times out of 10 they'd be very generous with their time. And don't be nervous, just get their advice. And it doesn't matter who they are, you'll sort of recognise them as a Le Mans driver or team boss in Formula 1 or F1 driver. Whoever it is, go and talk to them. You never know where it's going to go, where it's going to lead, who they might help you with if you get on well with them. It's those contacts are going to be absolutely vital. I used to find it quite funny with some of the drivers that I raced in Formula 3 that had connections or family members that were ex-Formula 1 drivers or something like that, and they always said, "Oh, the pressure is so intense because I've got to live up to my father's sort of career." But actually, I don't think they ever really realised the advantage they also had. And whilst I respect the pressure they were under, the contacts that they were sort of just given were actually just gold. I mean, you can't replicate that in such a short time. When you really need those contacts in Formula 3, they had them on the plate. So absolutely vital, that side. So yeah, it's sort of the talent will only get you so far. You've got to put the hard yards in with sponsors and contacts.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to know more about your time in British Formula 3. You mentioned it was an extremely competitive time for the series. Are there any races that particularly stand out to you, or moments where it was a really intense situation? And yeah, how did you kind of resolve that? Or any kind of standout memories from your time there? It sounds something to be a part of.
So I started British Formula 3 in 2005, and that was in what they call the national class, or B class, which was slightly older cars. Performance is almost identical to the international A class cars, but it was slightly less budgets, and also you could have the potential to impress people, or which hopefully would get you a better deal for the next year. So that was the sort of idea of doing it. I was really lucky to drive for Alan Docken Racing, who they ran loads of top drivers in their time. Mika Salo, Mark Webber.
Oh wow!
A few other people earlier, but just before me, obviously. And driving for Alan was just not only a lot of fun, but he taught me a lot about how the world works and how motorsport works. And I look back very fondly on my time driving for Alan in 2005 and 6. And then, 2007, I drove for R Racing, or at that time it was called Raken and Robertson Racing, which is Kimi's junior team in British Formula 3. And I think that propelled me to be a real front runner in the championship. Pole positions, race wins, and I think it was 5th in the championship, if I remember rightly. It's a long time ago now. But I really enjoyed that time, and I think anyone that was around British Formula 3 then will recognise that if you could excel as a Formula 3 driver in the UK, you could probably get away with doing almost anything else after that. What it would teach you, the laps that you would do, not just in racing but in testing, was huge. The cars themselves, most of the drivers were driving Dalaras. There were Lolas and Miguel's there at the time, something you don't get these days. It was an open formula. You could bring, if you wanted to make you could make your own car and off you go, as long as it hit the regulations. And I drove Dallara for all 3 years that I did, and in my book, that was the best car to have at the time. But you could do anything you wanted with it. If you wanted to make a new front wing or rear wing, up to you. Most teams didn't, because why would you try and do that? And Dallara have done their own thing, but some teams did. And I really enjoyed that side of it. There's a lot of technical developments. And again, if you're trying to train the driver to be a Formula 1 driver, which is what we were all trying to do, what better place to do it? It was really good fun times. There were no paddle shifts or anything like that. It was still a sequential gearbox. Really light cars, are probably 100 kilos less than they are now, or maybe more. I don't actually know what they weigh now, but they're really fun, good cars to drive. And of all the drivers I raced against, I think if you had them here for an interview like me, I think everyone would look back very fondly as driving those cars. They taught you everything you needed to know about being a racing driver, and the techniques that you learn, not just in terms of racing, but in terms of how to race them and the technique that's required. I don't think I've developed, but I don't think I've really changed anything from that time as a driver in terms of how I drive. It teaches you everything you want to know. going back to actually your question, I think standout moments. I remember my first Formula 3 podium, which was in national class, was a big moment for me because I was suddenly up against drivers that had done a couple of years in Formula Renault, and I had missed that step. I did Formula Renault Winter Series, but it was only 2 races. But I had missed that step where a lot of the real pros from karting were learning their craft. So I didn't really know how I was going to get on at that tier of racing until I did Formula 3 and started to get some podiums, and that was a big moment for me because I suddenly thought, well, actually, I may have won a Formula Prima Audi, but this is where the real talent is, and suddenly I'm doing all right. So that was a big moment for me, and it seems amazing to race a Formula 3 car at Notco actually now. That was quite cool. And other standout races, I think my first time, well, both times I raced in the Macau Grand Prix was extraordinary.
Absolutely. That was on my list of questions. The Macau, the track there is incredible, right? What was that like from your eyes?
I'd safely say it's the best track in the world. I'm a big lover of Spa, who isn't, but Macau is a challenge like I've never experienced ever before or after. It's ridiculously difficult. And one of the 2 reasons why that is the case, 3 reasons. A, you've got 35 budding F3 drivers that all trying to want to be in Formula 1. I think half of that grid actually did get to Formula 1. And so it's brutally competitive. So you've got all the guys from British Formula 3, from the European Formula 3 or German Formula 3, as it was in my time. And then I think there was even a couple of guys from Brazil. There was the Works, Tom's Toyota team coming from Japan. Everyone was going there, and there's a lot of pressure because if you knew if you're going to do well there, you might actually end up with a test deal with a Formula 1 team or even a race deal the following year. That was, there's a lot to prove. The other reason why it's so difficult is the street circuit, and then the last reason is the nature of the street circuit. It's there's 2 parts to it. The first part is absolutely flat out. You don't lift for, 30 seconds or something like that. There's a few very fast corners in that section. And then the second part is up the hill and back down the hill in very tight and twisty. So, of course, if you're going to run the car as quickly as you can, you want it, because that straight is so long, you've got to run it on minimal downforce. I mean, when I say minimal, the wings were almost non-existent. And of course, whilst that's fantastic in the first sector, the second sector and the third sector, it makes life very difficult. And the car is just moving around all over the shop, and it feels like the car is half the weight of what it would normally feel. It's quite amazing. So that makes it very difficult. And then that was quite extraordinary. That time doing that racing at that speed as well on the street circuit is amazing. It does definitely gets your attention, that's for sure.
Yeah, 100%. It sounds like a really incredible experience. I wanted to jump forward now from Formula 3 to what I think sounds like a really amazing experience would be testing the Williams Formula 1 car. Could you just explain a little bit about everything that goes into an F1 test day? What are the teams looking to gain from it, and how did you approach that for your first time as a driver?
So my tests were straight line speed testing and other testing that we were doing. So they weren't on an actual track, unfortunately, but it was behind the scenes work that the team and the drivers required at the time. The 2 drivers were Nico Rosberg and Kazuki Nakajima, and I guess they weren't available. So I slotted in and did a few tests for them, which was quite extraordinary. But yeah, in terms of preparation for myself, I think we did 2 or 3 days on the simulator at the factory at Grove, and that was very useful for me because you've got to remember I'd only done one GP2 test, so to suddenly jump from British F3 to a Formula 1 car was a big jump, and that was really useful for me to do those couple of days on the sim. In terms of learning the steering wheel layout and a few other bits and pieces like that. It was, I remember leaving with a whole manual of a car manual, which I studied obviously a huge amount after that. And that really helped me in preparation. But I don't think anything prepares you for turning up to the venue that we used and suddenly seeing, I think it was 4 or 5 trucks there, 30 personnel, and 1 car, and you're the driver. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary feeling, actually, and one I absolutely adored. But there's nothing secretive about it now. But one of the main reasons for the test was actually, or 2 main reasons. That one was, this was the end of 2008, where the regulations were changing massively. If you look at the 2008 car, you'll see a slightly narrower front wing, a chunky rear wing, and the height of the wings were quite different from what became the 2009 cars, which were very wide front wing and very narrow rear wing.
I was just going to say, we have one behind you now, just for reference. There is a 2009 car.
2009 car. You see exactly what I'm talking about. So, the front wing was probably 2/3 of that width. A big change in the aero regulations at that time. And as always, it was to promote better racing, because I think in 2007-8, I think people would have thought, we can try and do better than this. It's the age-old story about let's try and get better overtaking. And I obviously the car behind me, the Brawn, really stole the march on that with the double diffuser and a couple of other things that they had on the car, which we didn't think of at Williams, obviously.
Sure.
But what we were doing at the time was developing a KERS system, which was, I believe, the only flywheel KERS system on the grid. And that was really interesting because it was something that was, it was groundbreaking technology. And when I say a flywheel system, it was regaining the kinetic energy of the car and putting it into the flywheel, which was right behind the driver's back, where the fuel tank would have been if it was a normal size fuel tank at the time. And I can't remember exactly the RPM this thing was doing, but I reckon it was, I'm sure they said something like 80,000 RPM, and may have even gone higher than that. So it was quite interesting because I remember sitting in the car with the gantry overhead, ready to go out onto the runway, and suddenly there's a light above me, orange flashing light, as soon as the KERS is starting to be fired up in the garage, and you can feel it behind your back. It's it's whirring away. It's going quicker and quicker and quicker. And they told me that if there's any issue, don't step out the car, jump out the car, because the last thing you want to do is earth yourself, And it was at that point I realised why I got the job and not Nico Rosberg, for instance. But no such problems, and it was really interesting to develop that with them. And I believe that same technology is now on a lot of London buses, a lot of the underground trains, and a few other uses as well. And I think that a lot of that has gone into some Porsche systems as well. So a lot of the technology that we were developing then, it's quite exciting, and it's quite fun to note that it's had other uses that have helped in the world.
No, that's incredible. I'd love to know, beyond your time as a driver, a huge part of your kind of relationship with the business side of motorsport is in these old, almost retired cars, bringing them back to life and finding buyers for them. And now with Ingition, bringing a whole kind of collective experience to these owners and putting those cars out on track to create some really magical moments. Before we dive into exactly what Ingition is and how it's kind of grown, what's the used car market for race cars like? There must be a very small pool of buyers, and how do you fit into that market, and how did you even think that might be something you could do beyond your time in racing?
There was a small pool of buyers for those sorts of cars, but if you create a series that gives one of these older cars a purpose again, then suddenly everything changes. And the same thing happened back in the day with the 70s and 80s Formula One cars. I think you could pick them up at a sort of 10% of the value of what they are now. Wow. We're starting to see some values increasing of these 90s F1 cars, and rightly so in my book. I mean, they're about as cool as it gets. And if you go back a few years, then you could pick them up for in motorsport terms not a lot of money at all, because there was no reason to buy them other than put them in your kitchen or something like that. No one was running them. There was no reason to run them unless you just completely adored the cars and wanted to just do a track day every now and again. But 9 times out of 10 you would have been on your own on that track day. But since we started Ignition GP, we found a lot of people have approached us and said, we've got real interest in the same way as you have of these cars. How do we get involved? What do I need to go and buy? What car is eligible for your series? And yeah, I think values are going up quickly. You see pockets of these sort of things happening in historic motorsport. Again, the same thing happened with Le Mans cars. When was it 2017? It was announced that they were up to 2015 cars were eligible for Masters Historic Racing for Le Mans cars.
Right.
With the values of those. So I think the other side of what we're seeing generally in the classic car world, not just racing, is you're starting to see the next generation of car collector, and they now the guys that or girls that have got the money that to invest in these cars, they look at what might mean something to them, and it may be that they weren't around to watch the racing in the 70s or the early 80s with the DFV Cosworth era, but they very much remember the 90s F1 cars, and that's the cars that mean something to them. They might have watched it with their parents, and or gone to watch a Grand Prix with their parents or something, and actually it means far more emotionally to them to buy those cars than a 70s F1 car. So you're starting to see a bit of a shift of that. But I think generally in cars, the car collecting world, the 90s or late 80s, 90s cars are really increasing in value quite rapidly. And I think it's the same reason. They're the cars that mean something to the next collectors, the next generation of collector. So yeah, it's an interesting time at the moment. And I think 90s everything is coming back into fashion, even clothing, and some music. People can't wait to get those clothes back on. So it's a really interesting time.
Yeah, for sure. And in terms of the driving characteristics of those 90s cars, what is it that makes them so special around the track? And you mentioned earlier your time watching the 92 Monaco battle between Senna and Mansell, and just how amazing it was to watch those cars dance around those tiny windy streets. But what is it from behind the wheel that makes that era so special and kind of motivated you to set up Ignition to be that era of cars?
It's the closest thing I think motorsport has got to gladiators. I really believe that, and the reason is that you can see them working the wheel. You can see them going through the physical endurance of the thing. We don't have power steering. We don't have any almost most cars don't have driver aids or any assistance in any way. There's of course the FW15 and 14Bs and things like that have active suspension, a couple of other things on them, but in the majority you can see that the driver is really working, and I think that gives the viewer something that modern motorsport, modern Formula One starting to lack, unfortunately. I have full respect. As I say, I've driven against most of these drivers in Formula One now, but I feel that we are missing seeing them really wring the neck out of a car in the same way as the 90s Formula One. Obviously, the safety side that's gone with that is something that's only to be applauded, and that's obviously a good thing. But I love that they really are genuine gladiators, that you can see them working away, and they get out of the car and they are genuine. They were fit then, obviously not as fit as they are now, but they were fit, and they were still getting out of the car and they were completely exhausted. Drinks bottles and all that stuff. They didn't have those. And I love that part of the seeing the drivers really working the wheel, but also the stories that went with it. And you just can't, in my book, you just can't beat that time in Formula One. I think that's everything. And that's why I've set up Ignition, because I adore these cars and the drivers that go with it. And the majority of them are still fit enough to, or able enough to get back into the cars and demonstrate them every now and again, which is wonderful.
So since you've started Ignition, what are some of the jewels of the collections that you've seen on track? I know there was a video that you filmed with Jodie Kidd where she was walking around Donington there, and just the amount of incredible old Formula One cars you had in that paddock. I think one that stood out to you, I remember in the video, was the 92 McLaren, one of Ayrton Senna's real old cars being taken back out onto the track. But alongside that, what have been some really incredible cars that you've seen?
Yeah, you're right. That was probably one of the finest cars that you could ever want for an Ignition meeting. And that actual chassis, Ayrton qualified on pole for Monza in '92, and Gerhard Berger, I believe, won the Canadian Grand Prix in that car as well. I hope I've got that right, but I'm pretty sure that's what that. So to have something like that with that history that you can never replicate with something else. That's just perfection to me. I really think that's wonderful. And to go to other cars, we've had a Damon Hill 1993 FW15C, probably the most technically advanced car of that time. ABS, active suspension, power steering. They even tried a CVT gearbox on that car. It was quite extraordinary. So that was quite wonderful to have that car last year. And then obviously Adrian bringing a couple of his cars was a real honour to have that going to one of our events. So we had the 2004 MP4 19B at Donington a couple of months ago, and that was Kimi's old car. Hadn't run since 2004, and yeah, we had Adrian driving it, and Adrian's son. Harrison driving it, and he actually broke the lap record, which is something we weren't really aiming for, but was absolutely wonderful that he did it, and he was really wringing the neck out of that car. So to see that car diving down the crane of curves was quite extraordinary, and that's one of the things that I love about Ignition, that we can do these things and still have the ability to see these cars not just driving around, but driving around at reasonable speed. So that was good. And obviously Adrian was in his 1990 Leyton house, and you talked about earlier about what Adrian's done for Formula One. Well, you just need to look at that car, and you can, if you look at all the other cars on the grid around that time, 89, 90, it just looks so vastly different. And and it really was the founding principle of aerodynamics, really, of that time, that a lot of people then copied after that. So that was really great to have that car. But one of the other parts of Ignition that I really enjoy is that we don't just concentrate on the cars that would have won a race back then. It would have been remiss of us to not also celebrate all the cars that raced in Formula One. And so you name it, we can try and get it there. We've got Naughties, we've got an Onyx last time out.
Wow.
But those that, each car has its own story and its own history, and if you delve more deeply into one of these cars, you find a lot more behind the scenes than you ever would have thought of. And that's one of the things with Ignition. We can celebrate not just the race winning cars, but every car.
And do you think that, you mentioned how the current era of like what's valuable in the used race car market is what people have memories of mostly in that kind of 90s window. As we look to the future, can you see the collection expanding to, kind of late noughties Formula cars, past 2004, maybe even a 2009 Williams potentially?
what I'd give to drive that car again would be, yeah, I'd be, it'd be wonderful to drive that Williams again. That's an interesting question. I mean, there's a few other people that have approached us and said, I've got XYZ that's after 97. Can I come along? And I think the way we might start to head potentially is to have two classes of cars. And 89 to 97 will always be class number 1, and then class number 2 can be something like 98 up to 2005, I would say, because it's V10 era.
Yeah.
But certainly we'd look at the V8s as well. I think when you get into the hybrid era, it's blooming difficult, really. Even when we ran the Brawn, we had 7 guys working on the car. And a few of those were Mercedes guys. You've really got to be careful and you've got to look after these cars. And in the Brawn's case, there's only one engine in the world that's the right spec, and it's in that car. So you've got to look after it.
Yeah.
So, we'd look at other cars from other eras. I don't think the turbo era, as much as I love it as well, I don't think we're going to get involved in that, because it's there's a lot more involved in running turbos and running them reliably. But yeah, certainly everything up to hybrid can always be looked at, as long as it can be run safely, properly, and look after the cars and drivers.
Yeah, and it seems like that's really at the core of the power and the marketing message of the series, is selling that dream of really getting these incredible cars back on track and where they're supposed to be. I wanted to know, just finally, what would your advice be in terms of motorsport entrepreneurship? Because as someone who's clearly had success yourself, there's a lot of people looking to not only, we mentioned earlier, approaching motorsport from the driver side, but so much beyond that happens off the track, and people looking to get into that business side of motorsport. With the experience you've had, is there anything that stands out beyond just kind of traditional business advice that everyone would get? Maybe something specific to racing?
I think if you want to get involved in racing, go and do work experience and offer your services to a Formula 3 team, Formula 4 team, doesn't matter who it is. An older friend of mine said, you've got to have, in this industry, you've got to have road dust. And that's always been in the back of my mind, that basically what he meant by that is you've got to put the work in and learn the industry. And I think if you want to get into motorsport, motorsport's probably a good sport to be involved in, almost regardless of what you want to do in your life, in a way, because it does teach you a lot about how the world works, and not just how you thought it works, but how it actually works. And I would suggest, if I had my time all over again, I'd probably offer my services as a work experience, summer jobs at racing teams, whatever series they're in, and just say, look, I want to do a couple of months with you or something like that. You'll learn so much, and you'll meet some really interesting people and helpful people for your career. I can't ever imagine that wouldn't be a time well spent.
Absolutely. And also, last thing I've got written down on my list, who do you think is going to win this weekend when we head to Monza with Formula One?
I think, given Red Bull's straight line speed, I think it'd be hard to question Verstappen on that. Yeah. I really do hope that Mercedes can be a bit more consistent with their, as they do as well. So it'd be interesting to see whether, we're coming from Zandvoort to Monza, two very different circuits. It'd be interesting to see how they perform. I think my money would probably be on Verstappen again. He's driving so incredibly well. Real art form at the moment, and obviously the car is probably the best. It is the best car on the grid. So yeah, that's where my money is.
I know, we need to ask Adrian to just slow it down a bit, keep it interesting, because he's really he's just going to run away with this championship if it doesn't stay like that.
He would say let everyone else catch up if they can. So it's up to
absolutely.
They've obviously done an absolutely amazing job with the new regulations. It will close up. It always does with the new regs. Some teams do, like the Brawn behind me. That some teams come out strong with a new regulation. But yeah, it will start to close up, and don't count out Mercedes for long. Be interesting.
Absolutely. I think everyone's hoping we should get at least one win this year from Mercedes, if not more. But time is definitely running out for them. But I think
it's there. I hope that Lewis will win a race this year. I'm sure he will. There's obviously not much between Lewis and George, which I think is an incredible testament to George at the moment, driving very, very well. But yeah, obviously Lewis has won a race, I think, in every season he's ever done in Formula One.
Yep.
So yeah, I think I'm rooting for him for a race win.
100%. Well, it should be an exciting end to the season, and this has been a really fascinating interview. So thank you, Jonathan. Hopefully, in a few years, I'll be coming to you with my retro Formula One car, and we can get that out on track.
That would be fantastic. Yeah, I would love to have you.
All right, awesome. Thanks for coming on the show, Jonathan. And I'll be back next week with more news from across the Formula One world.